doing not a lot of videos for the Isle of Man at the moment. I'm just incensed by what's going on, I suppose. This is a short video, relatively short, referring to an interview on Manx Radio that took place in February this year with Lizzie and your consultants. And there's so many things in it that I think are worth explaining and expanding. My role here is try to educate enough people in the Isle of Man, in the public, so they can begin, sorry, my eye hurts at times, where they can begin to understand the issues here and start to challenge the nonsense that's being given to you. So I'll go through the video, stop and start it, and with the key points, and try to explain what rubbish you're being told.
Onshore wind, Manx Utilities Board have endorsed a recommendation to progress Eristane and Scarg to the environmental impact assessment and design stage. Based on the initial assessments undertaken by Wardell Armstrong, Manx Utilities say this appears to offer the best value to the electricity consumers of the Isle of Man, with the lowest environmental impact compared to other option sites.
Right, so this interview on Manx Radio was in February this year. So at that point, they seem to know already that it's the best value. But where are the prices? Why aren't they showing you it's the best value? So I find that the claims here well ahead, and also the impact. Well, they haven't done the surveys. There's been no bad thing. There's been no bird thing. There's been nothing. And so what they're doing is just bulldozing this. It's absolutely absurd at this point. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the individual points made by Lizzie and Paul in particular. I'm going to actually clip them and show you the truth on their claim. Okay?
So Manx Utilities have been set several targets by the Isle of Man government with regards to the decarbonisation of electricity on the Isle of Man. So first target we have is to deliver at least 20 megawatts of onshore renewables by 2026, with another target which is to deliver 100% decarbonised electricity by 2030.
You've got a lot coming in the next 5 years or so. I mean, it's 2025 next year. And within the next 5 years, you and the Isle of Man are going to be, zero carbon, as it were. So this is just the beginning, this 20 megawatts of power in the wind farm, just the beginning, right? But the ignorance that's going to be displayed here by these participants in this interview is such that it just does need exposing. And I'm going to try and really simplify it because there's a lot of word salads there to confuse you. So my job is to take the word salad out, make it simple and explain.
So we've progressed with our onshore wind project, and based on the information we have to date, believe it is deliverable by 2026. We've done a lot of feasibility work on the delivery of a second interconnector, which supports our 2030 target.
Now, in some magic world, they're relying on the interconnector to provide green energy, for which they have to pay a premium. That's done by the UK saying, well, so much of our energy today is green. From the way it isn't really, but so much of our energy is green, etc. And we're going to sell certificates for that. So when you buy the premium price. Yes, premium price. This is from an industry that is suffering terribly, and that's actually building gas power stations at the moment. But never mind, you're relying on someone else to give you the green energy. This itself is a fallacy. I could go into detail, but for the moment I just want to make the point that that is your plan, to get a lot of the green energy at a premium price, losing your independence and making sure you're going to get it from what is currently the highest price forward in the developed world for energy.
We're also doing some background work and feasibility studies at the moment with regards to another project, which is to do with having carbon neutral dispatchable generation on the Isle of Man. So dispatchable on demand, you can start it instantly no matter what the weather's doing.
Hold on, industry jargon, what was that?
So we recognise that resources like wind and solar are not 100% guaranteed on any day, and we have a responsibility on the Isle of Man to deliver security of supply, so we have to be able to meet our customers' demand for electricity regardless of what the weather is doing.
Well, already you have a lot of diesel generation as backup, which you can always meet your peak demands with, like the TT race time and so on. But this plan is to use the same generators, really, but use biofuel. Now, besides the huge damage biofuel does to the planet, the environmental costs of it, it is very, very expensive. So just imagine you're changing it from just diesel going into your generators to biofuel going into your generators. And what does that result in? A huge increase in cost.
Hey, Paul, hi. Good afternoon, Paul.
Hello.
The important thing for the Isle of Man is this is our money. Is it going to work? Is this going to be profitable for Manx Utilities, for us?
Yeah, I mean, in general, onshore wind is accepted to be sort of the cheapest form of new energy generation, bar none. That includes gas, nuclear, obviously hydro, that sort of thing. So in general, yeah, it's fair to say that onshore wind is the way to go if you want a cost-effective energy source.
You have just seen two examples, by the way. Well, because you're doing wind, immediately you've got to look for the backup. You've got to look for the diesel or the interconnector. So as soon as you have wind, there's all sorts of extra costs besides the actual cost itself. And in this case, of course, you got all the calculations wrong of the actual cost itself. But to say that it's the cheapest, that it's recognised, is simply not true. By far, gas is the cheapest. In the UK, I'll give you an example. We had a peak in gas prices because of the Ukraine war, okay, and gas became more expensive than wind for a while. But after that, gas became back and we got it cheaper again. Now, if you take the last 5 years in the UK, that's before the Ukraine invasion and after, and you just run it all the time without wind, we'd have saved £18 billion just on doing that by not having the wind. Today, gas is the cheapest. So what he's just said there is not true. End of subject. Not true.
Payback at the moment is a tricky one. We're expecting that the wind farm, assuming that the performance is delivering what we expect it to deliver, it could generate up to a third of electricity on the Isle of Man each year. So the figures that are published in our annual reports for how much we spent on gas are in the public domain, and you could look at those figures and offset a third of the money we spent on gas. It's not quite as clear cut as that because we start to impact the efficiency of the existing assets and we can't quite run them in the same way. So it's not quite that clear cut. But based on existing annual reports and the information within those reports, payback could be between 2 and 4 years.
There you are in that word salad, payback, 2 to 4 years. You can pay the entire thing back. Now, don't forget what you need for this is what she said, by the way, is the 36 or 40 million or so for the wind farm. That's going to be paid back in 2 years. And then there's the interconnector, that's 220 million. And then there's this diesel generator business. You may have to replace the diesel generators themselves, I would imagine. I don't know. And all the extra costs of buying in on the interconnector, the green energy, the certified green energy. But payback is suddenly going to be, whilst they put the prices up for you, 2 to 4 years. If you believe that, then, I can sell you a great bridge from London. It's London Bridge. Now, what's coming up now is some total misunderstandings of the basics to do with this technology. And it's not just from Lizzie, it's from Paul, and I think she's getting the advice from Paul. But let me explain something super clear to you, absolutely clear and simple. If you assume the wind turbine in a perfect condition every second of the year can produce X electricity, the load factor is what percentage that you get out in practice. So in other words, the load factor is at the end of the day what measures what you get out of the wind turbine. That's what it is. And it doesn't matter how that came about. It doesn't matter what turbine, it doesn't matter what wind. What matters is that's actually what you get out. So knowing how much energy you're getting out to sell, to provide you with, is fundamental. So the load factor is the end result of it all. Now, what they're trying to say, and I'll try to explain the confusion as they go through this word salad that's coming up, because they really don't understand it. And they're going to make statements that are absurd. But the other thing is they get mixed up on constraints, so I'll explain it in advance. In the UK, we have to contract with wind farms to pay not what they supply us with. They have to be paid for what they could supply us with. Now, whether it be a constraint limitation on the transmission, or we just don't need the energy because there's too much wind overnight, we don't need it, we still have to pay. So they shut down and then we still pay for the estimated electricity. But the load factor, and this is really critical, the load factor doesn't have any influence on that because, for example, and there's one Scottish wind farm that was shut down 51% of the time, but it didn't change the load factor because they did the estimate and get the whole load factor. So what I did in my talk when I came to the Isle of Man was I added the shutdown time to what they produced to get the total, and that gave the load factor. So constraint payments got nothing to do with load factors at all. And both Lizzie and Paul are totally up the creek on this one. So it doesn't influence it. So you're not going to get a higher load factor because you shut down. It doesn't make any difference whether you shut down or not, because the load factor is what, in the essence, in that case where they're shutting down, what it could produce. So it makes no difference at all. I hope that's made it clear. Yeah? So I'll give you an example to make it even clearer. If a wind farm can produce 100 units of electricity, and therefore at that level, let's say that's a 50% load factor. So let's say the perfect world, it would give us 200, but because of a 50% load factor, it's giving us 50. Okay? Now I ask the wind farm to shut down for 10% of the time. So instead of giving us 50, it gives us 40. But the load factor is still 50 because that's what it could have done. So the load factor is not influenced whatsoever by constraint payments, and I made that totally clear in my Isle of Man talk.
So I think the first question was on the load factor, and I'll let Paul come in on this as well, but it's not really part of our estimated yield at all in the assessment for calculation. So what we do is we look at the wind speeds that are achieved at the site, and we are measuring them. So it's a fact-based approach, and we compare those to the actual performance curves that are from the manufacturers and measured in situ from site. So fairly accurate calculations on the amount that we're producing.
Let me unscramble that, what she's just said. The load factor is the end result. You can do all the calculations for the amount of wind you think you have and so on, and how that passes through the turbine to end up with electricity. Because the load factor there, it gives you the load factor. So, and actually they're giving you that. They're saying 62%, but they're not being like, it's in a bit of a fog. And they're saying the load factor or capacity factor, the same thing, is 62%. So that's what you end up with. It is supremely important. It's what it's all about, right? What matters is the amount of energy coming out. And you don't start off with a load factor. You start off with, as they've said, the wind and the calculations. But then you have to look at what load factors, what actually comes out of all the turbines in the world. And you're making a world record bar none, not just by a slight margin, but by a huge margin. And so we'll go into that. But to say the load factor is not important, she's really misunderstanding the role of it. And they're actually using one. They're using a 62% one. So they can't sort of in one hand say it's not important when it's the amount of electricity coming out.
I suppose with regards to the weather on the island, we typically have wind from the southwest. And if you look at the Irish Sea and where that wind is channeled from between Ireland and Great Britain, you can see why that site is hit by that wind or that prevailing wind condition significantly all the time, especially where we move to the sort of hurricanes and storms that move up through the Irish Sea.
The fact is, we are lucky. We have a wind farm just 20 miles offshore, an offshore wind farm which always gives a higher amount of electricity, a higher load factor than ones onshore. And that's producing in the region of 40%. And normally onshore would be about 10% less than that, which would give you 30%. And that's subject to identical winds to you. The only advantage is it hasn't got all the roughness of land for the wind to pass over, cause the turbulence and cause the loss, which is why onshores are always about 10% or more less as regards the yield than offshore.
So yes, weather is comparable, but I think the other thing to mention with load factor broadly, which as I said is not really relevant for our calculations, but it is when you look at the average factors across the UK. You do have older designs to contend with, so the Viking project in Shetland Islands, I think, was commissioned in 2003.
You see, this is what they do. They give you complete misinformation like that. What they're saying is the older turbines just couldn't hack it. Yeah, they were less efficient, but not by the margins they're talking about. What the biggest gain actually in performance is with wind turbines is height. But never mind. What they've just quoted there is that it was 2003. It's 21 years ago. Do you know when it was finished? Do you know when it was? They tried to get it through in 2003, but it's only just been built. In fact, it was last month, September 2024, when it was completed using modern turbines. And here they just give misinformation to you all the time, and you will find this. So I've looked in my previous video I did to this one for you in the Isle of Man. I pointed out that after 1 or 2 years, recent the last 4 years, wind farms that have been built are not producing anything like what they're claiming.
So we have much more modern designs now that are more structurally robust and able to operate and perform better in higher winds. But the other aspect that's really significant, especially for UK wind farms, is the amount of curtailment.
Here we get a word salad on curtailment. She doesn't understand it. She thinks that curtailment changes the load factor. It doesn't. Some journalists misuse it and publish figures like, well, Viking can only get 16% load factor because it's curtailed. But that isn't the load factor. And I've given a list of the Scottish wind farms with their load factors. And when you look at that list, and I use it in my talk, the curtailment was added to the supplied to get the load factor.
So, for example, if we installed a 100 megawatt wind farm at Erie-Staine, and to be clear, Manx Utilities has no plans to do that, we would not be able to see a high capacity factor. We would have to curtail it at least 60% of the time because our demand is just not high enough to accommodate that.
Another incorrect statement there. If you had a 100 megawatt turbine in there, you wouldn't be getting out more, let's say a load factor of, 50% to make life simple. Obviously that's too high, but let's just say that. Then you'd be getting out 50 megawatts on average. Now, what she's assuming there is the 100 can be curtailed 60% of the time. Well, very rarely would it be curtailed, actually, because it's only giving you 50 megawatts on average. Now, so it's not a direct relationship to the size of the turbine. It's compared to what you get out. She's made simple assumptions there, which are technically wrong.
No, definitely. I mean, load factor is not a particularly good measure of performance of a wind turbine generally. Turbines are designed in such a way so that the load factor is sort of dependent on the wind conditions that they're sited in. So it'd be relatively simple to invent a wind turbine that would have a near 100% load factor simply by putting a very large rotor on a very small generator.
Now, what he said there is that the load factor is not a particularly good indicator of a turbine. And in that technical sense, he's right. Because if you're comparing one turbine with another, and you just look at the load factors at two different farms with two different turbines, that's meaningless. Because the load factor is everything. It's the actual outcome. And that depends how windy it is, what height it is, all that sort of thing. So if you're looking at comparing turbines, the load factor doesn't come into it. Right? But that is totally misrepresenting what all this is about. The load factor in this case is critical. It's the end result of what you get out. And we're not talking about, nor are you interested in comparing one turbine with another. And this is where they get mixed up in their own technical world, their own technical jargon. So I hope you understand my point. In one sense, he's right, but he's missing the point.
So overall, it's not really the best measure because ultimately it will come down to the equipment we select and the conditions that we put it in. Like Lizzie said, it makes a lot more sense to look at the actual wind conditions, which we're up there monitoring, and then comparing those to manufacturer specifications, and then taking into account other things such as turbulence, losses due to interactions between the turbines, that sort of thing, and coming up with a calculated energy yield.
Yes, and when you get the calculated energy yield he's talking about, it gives you the load factor. Yes, that is what comes out at the end of this. right? So no one's interested in comparing one thing and another inside that. And in actual fact, what you've done here is publish a lot of different ones, but let's say the main one is the 62% load factor you've now published on a chart. Let's say that, or, that is before you've applied the power curve and everything else for the particular turbine you haven't chosen yet. So until you've chosen all these things, you actually do not know what the load factor is. In fact, to be puritanical about it, you don't know what the load factor is until you've measured when it's up and running and you see what you actually get out. And that is critical. So to even be giving what's available, 62% available, I'm not interested in what's available. What I'm interested in is what you get out of it for the people of the Isle of Man.
As far as the load factor or capacity factor, you're using that as a sales pitch to get to say that a third of the island's electrical usage will be covered by the turbines. But you're saying 71%. Shetland, which is way windier than we are, I mean, it's in the top of the North Sea and the North Atlantic. If they're getting 46, and Ørsted's own consortium website is saying the average across the UK, including our latitude, is 26, then I don't see how the payback that Bonzo referred to, how can you get your payback when you're kind of boosting your sales pitch by 4 times more than the reality of what I'm reading? I mean, even if you get to Shetland Islands levels that they've recorded, I know you're talking about older types, but with Ørsted are very up to date. If they're saying 26% on their latest 11,500 fleet of turbines, how are you getting to 71%? Anyway,
What Lizzie is going to say now totally demonstrates a lack of understanding of the subject. She's going to talk about because of the limitation on the constraints, it changes the load factor. It doesn't. It just doesn't.
And again, just to capture the comments on load factor, the turbines we're talking about with Ørsted, just to take that off, as I said, they are limited by what the output that can be delivered because of demand. So particularly with projects that are commissioning at the moment with National Grid, they are requesting that operators dial back their output. They have constraint payments that are awarded to limit the output of turbines simply because the network will not at all times be able to carry that amount of power. So there's a massive upgrade project going on in particularly the northwest of England at the moment to help transport that amount of power. So if you're an operator, while in theory you might be able to deliver a higher capacity factor, it will be curtailed. So that impacts directly the capacity factor. But to be clear, Manx Utilities figures and our estimates do not take into account the load factor or capacity factor at all. It is based on actual output versus the wind conditions.
Oh dear, actual output when you haven't even built it yet. Let me explain something, Lizzie. Actual output is what you measure once you've built it. That's the actual output. What you're talking about is a theoretical amount of energy available without having even passed it through a turbine. This is incredible.
Based on performance curves provided by manufacturing. So load factor and capacity factor isn't used at all in any of the calculations.
Yes, Lizzie, calculations, and they aren't used. The capacity factor or load factor, same thing, is not used because it's the end result, what you get out. You calculate how much energy you get now, compared it to the perfect energy world, and that's what you get out. So it doesn't come into the calculation. But then that's not the actual world. The load factor is the actual world out at the end.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, Julie. We've got lots of people to get to.
thanks, Andy. Cheers.
Good to hear from you. Thanks for that. Just a couple of quick questions. Can anybody answer whether or not there's going to be storage for the electricity that's generated? If so, where's it going to be done, Lizzie?
Right, you're going to hear another word salad here from Lizzie about storage. And she correctly claims that storage is expensive. It is extremely expensive. But she's mixing up two things. So I'm going to have to tell you something. Storage for intermittent energy is the amount of energy you can store somewhere to fill in the gaps. Yeah, that is the storage. But there's another type of what you could call storage, it's micro storage, It's the same as a flywheel. I'll actually, in the description below this video, put my flywheel video. But just like you have on an engine a flywheel to smooth out the strokes of the pistons, you also have that with electricity. And the whole object of that is to control the frequency, to keep the frequency stable. On a national grid, you've got to keep the amount of energy being used, the amount of input in balance, but you've also got to keep the frequency in balance. So don't confuse the frequency, which is storing from 1 millisecond to another, if you like. Don't confuse that with storage for intermittence. And I think she does confuse it here.
Yeah, so we don't have any plans at the moment to do any storage on the Isle of Man, and it's a technical reason. We don't need to have storage. Typically, when you have storage in the UK or to support renewable projects, it's to dampen to some extent the way they behave and the way they may impact grid frequency. So we have to operate our network within strict limits, and storage can help you avoid those limits. The difference on the Isle of Man, though, is we have an HVAC interconnector between the island and Great Britain. So we are tied to the UK's grid frequency. We can't change that. So the benefits of storage in terms of moderating frequency don't apply to us, which has got a lot of benefits as well, because storage at the moment is still really costly relative to other generation techniques, and we don't need it to maintain stability on our system. In fact, you would only really need it if you took the interconnector out of service, and we typically have operated on this island since it was installed with it out of service for less than 1 to 2% of the time. So really, really good availability on that asset.
Well, so there we are. Basically, you've got people who are really out of the depth with this, and you've got a consultant there confusing the issues on load factor. The way they're escaping from it is because I raised it. Now, what I'm saying is, in essence, forget the word load factor. I'm saying what energy you get out of the system is critical, and you're overestimating it. All I can think of, and I don't know it's right, is they're talking about the amount of energy available. And that's the word they use on that chart, 62% chart, energy available. That's very different to what the turbine produces to get out. Yes? So could it be that until you actually put it into the power curve, and then you do this, then you do that, and you do the estimates, and you say, this is what we should get out. But the trouble is, they're telling you what they get out. They're telling you between 100 gigawatt hours and 130 gigawatt hours a year, which are unbelievable load factors of up to 74%. So, I'm lost. I'm lost in this. I really would advise the government in your case, or Manx Utilities, to ask for a consultant. I'm suggesting the one from Edinburgh University, who's a specialist in this, who studies the real world figures, who studies the economics of wind farms, who's done all the work on how long they last, the operating costs, not from what people say, but from actual accounts. And he has done the work. Try to get him, he's a busy man, but just get him to validate the sort of 100 to 130 gigawatts. So what they're saying is we don't need load factors, we just calculate it. They then confuse their theoretical with the actual without actually taking it through all the process. So this is like children running this organisation, and I'm afraid I don't trust any of them. I mean, Lizzie, I'm sure, has been told all this rubbish. She believes it, I'm sure, but she doesn't understand enough to be in that position, and frankly, none of the people around that table do. I think the interviewer does a good job. He asks practical questions. What about storage? He doesn't mean frequency storage when he says that. He means storage to back up the intermittent wind. Yeah, he gets an answer about frequency because she doesn't understand the subject. So I'm making this video into just a separate video to publish straight away as a background video in trying to, in effect, educate, I'm sorry to use that word, but educate the public in the Isle of Man so they begin to understand the technicalities and how things are getting confused. And I hope this video has helped in that. Thank you for watching.